What up, everybody? I'm on the interwebs again. Striking back. How was everyone's day? My kids are asleep, so I'm thrilled. Well, folks, I know that this stream has been a consistent source of rants and otherwise yelling, but I thought we'd take a night off from that this evening and do a little bit of learning together. Do a little bit of educating the folks. And, watch something together that I think is very important for the average human being that is living in the end stage of America to see. And that is my favorite John Oliver segment that he's ever done, which was actually fairly recent, about a month ago. I'm not really an enormous fan of the show. I mean, I watch every episode that he does just simply because I get a reminder on YouTube, and I'm just like, okay. There are some things that he's been right on, some things that he's been wrong on, some things that he's been not particularly awesome with, mainly any time that like the left has any sort of like global or the left anywhere in the globe is making any kind of headway or progress. So what I figured we could do is just watch this together and talk about it. Maybe learn a thing or two. And, yeah. So let's do this thing. Tell me in the chat if you can't hear it.
Our main story tonight concerns history. A subject so fascinating, we're sometimes willing to do crazy experiments like this.
Scientists were able to mimic Nessie Amun's voice by recreating his mouth and vocal cords with a 3D printer. It allowed...
Before we get much farther, I do want to say, John Oliver, not a very funny guy, but and even less funny when he's like in his basement by himself. But anyway, here we go.
Allowed them to produce a single sound.
Excellent. Finally, an answer to the question that scholars have asked for ages: what would an ancient Egyptian sound like if he orgasmed while taking antidepressants? But look, sadly, history isn't always fun, weird, mummy ventriloquy. It can be painful too, as America has recently been reminded. Because George Floyd's murder has forced a hard national...
Hold the phone. Getting a little cocky about my internet connection, you guys.
Has forced a hard national conversation about this country's present, which is impossible to do effectively without re-examining its past. And unfortunately...
I fixed my internet today.
That's not a conversation that all Americans are well equipped to have, because there are some embarrassing gaps in many people's knowledge of US history. Just look what happened a few weeks back when the president, in the midst of nationwide black...
Alright, hold on. Paused for technical difficulties.
Lives Matter protests.
Oh my God,
plans
not
to hold a
paused for
rally in
technical
Tulsa
difficulties.
on
Jesus.
June 19. A decision astonishingly tone deaf for two key reasons.
Next Friday, June 19th, is Juneteenth, an annual holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the U.S. As for Tulsa, 99 years ago this month in 1921, the city witnessed the Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the nation's worst outbreaks of racial violence, recently portrayed in HBO's Watchmen.
Now, the reason they're mentioning Watchmen there is a lot of Americans learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre for the very first time, nearly a century after it happened, from watching that show. Basically, the night that episode aired, many white Americans went, holy shit, I had no idea this happened, while many black Americans went, holy shit, white people are going to freak the fuck out when they find out this happened. Debbie at work is going to want to have a conversation. The coverage of that Trump rally didn't just introduce many Americans to that massacre, but also to the very concept of Juneteenth, the day that commemorates when Union troops informed Texas that enslaved people there must finally be freed, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, by the way. A recent poll showed that a shocking 48%...
All right. So there's our first stopping point. Imagine that as a country, we made slavery illegal. And there was such a vested interest in that not being the case by the majority of the people that live here, that it took 2 years for people to get that news from Virginia to Texas. And before you say, well, I mean, come on, Kyle, they were, on horseback or whatever, and that's how we spread news back in the day. You are correct. However, really? 2 years? Like, you don't think that was a bunch of guys just saying, like, oh, shh, don't say nothing?
Of Americans were either not at all or not very aware of Juneteenth, which is not good. I mean, it'd be fine if nearly half of Americans were unaware of Groundhog Day, the meaningless date when an idiot dressed like Goth Willy Wonka holds up a non-clairvoyant woodchuck whose face somehow screams, I have better things to do. But Juneteenth actually means something. And that's just one of many gaps in knowledge that some are now realising that they have. Just watch Joy Behar try to explain what...
If you haven't seen this, strap in, because my boy's about to get to cooking.
Why statues of George Washington should be left alone, and in doing so, actually learning something.
The George Washington, besides being a founding father and a great general and somebody who was so instrumental in this union that we had, in this republic, also freed his slaves. So if you're going to take somebody down, take down Thomas Jefferson. He didn't free his slaves. No? Sonny disagrees.
He didn't free his slaves. He actually spent the last year of his life relentlessly pursuing slaves that tried to run away. He was a...
Also, this is a fact that I don't believe John Oliver mentions here. But you know how when we were all, in school, and there was this story about how, or I don't even know if this was something that we got from school, but I definitely remember it being on Fairly Odd Parents, that George Washington had wooden teeth. Do you recall this? So, that's not true. George Washington, all of his teeth fell out, as, most people's did in the, 18th century when George Washington was alive. And you know what he did? He had them replaced with manually pulled slave teeth.
Horrible slave owner.
Yeah, he was. As usual, Sonny Hostin is very right, and Meghan McCain is very there. Because while Washington did promise to free...
Meghan McCain, the number one living proof of the need for a wealth tax and a inheritance tax on rich people. She has gotten by just being a dipshit on national television because her dad was rich and well connected.
Free his slaves in his will. It specified they wouldn't gain their freedom until his wife's death. So only one person was freed immediately after Washington died out of over 100. Also, he actually became a slave owner at just 11 years old, a fact so horrifying, it's kind of hard to know what to do with it. At the very least, the story of him chopping down a cherry tree as a child and admitting it to his father by saying, I cannot tell a lie, gets way less charming if the next part is his parents saying, thank you for being honest, George. As a reward,
here's a slave!
And the thing is, Joy Behar's version of history, while distorted, is definitely more palatable, especially for white people. And seeking out misleadingly comforting versions of history is a pattern that we've seen again and again this year. From the #1 movie on Netflix during the protests following George Floyd's murder being The Help, to just last week when Senator Tom Cotton said schools should lose federal funding if they teach a curriculum based on the New York Times' 1619 project, which brings slavery into the forefront of American history. And perhaps the most absurd disconnect was in the wake of President Obama's eulogy for John Lewis this week, in which Obama advocated for abolishing the filibuster if necessary to expand voting rights. Tucker Carlson had this to say.
Imagine if some greasy politician showed up at your loved one's funeral and started...
Tucker Carlson, the heir to the Swanson Frozen Foods family fortune. A man who is now the #1 watched anchor on Fox News now that we've gotten rid of Goblin Bill O'Reilly. This man was originally on MSNBC, which gives you an idea of the fluidity of that network's particular cadre of ghouls. And many people have told contemporaneous stories of Tucker Carlson going on to panels on CNN before the Iraq War and advocating for it as hard as humanly possible, and then walking out back of the studio, lighting a cigarette, and going, I don't really give a shit about this.
Throwing around stupid partisan talking points about Senate procedure. Can you imagine that? You would be shocked if that happened. You'd probably walk out. Desecrating a funeral with campaign slogans?
Tucker Carlson's entire host style is just, can you believe that people are out there expressing themselves?
What kind of person would do that?
Wait, what kind of person would honour a friend's legacy by continuing to advocate for voting rights? You know what? I can think of one. John fucking Lewis would do that. And the truth is, with so many people misunderstanding our...
It's okay, I asked Tori's permission first.
Or very much on purpose. We thought tonight it might be a good idea to talk about how the history of race in America is currently taught in schools, what some of the gaps are, why they're there, and how we can fill them. And let's start with the fact there are no national standards for what topics or figures students must learn about at school, and state standards vary widely. When CBS looked into it this year, it found 7 states do not directly mention slavery in their state standards, only 2 mention white supremacy, while 16 list states' rights as a cause of the Civil War. And we actually did a whole 21-minute piece about what is wrong with that argument, but this clip explains...
In case you need a refresher, the Civil War was absolutely not about states' rights. Absolutely not. At all. In any way. Just wanted to throw that out there.
...it significantly quicker.
The root cause of the Civil War is clear.
What caused the Civil War was
slavery.
The main cause and why the South decided to secede was slavery.
So why do our history textbooks get it so wrong?
Y'all don't want to deal with the fucked up shit that y'all ancestors did.
Yeah. I mean, that pretty much sums it up. And it can be hard to deal with what your ancestors did. Trust me.
This is a thing that we have as a society, which is like, we don't have an ability to reckon with things that we have done. This is just a fact. We don't have an ability to reckon with the things that may have been particularly bad in our past. We just don't have an ability to do it. And so there are instances where, like, okay, here's a good for instance. Let me give you just a quick little historical tidbit that he's not going to cover, but I think is a very important point to make in the grand scheme of, like, man, this is how badly we educate our children on what our history is. Okay? At the end of World War II, we'll all recall, and you'll recall from your high school U.S. history class or your even middle school, like, American history class or whatever, that we were, of course, at war with the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese. You'll also recall a story probably being told to you if you went to a public school like I did, that before we bombed the Japanese, before we dropped 2 nuclear warheads on the Japanese, we made the decision to fly overhead and drop pamphlets onto Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay? And the idea being that our quarrel was not with the Japanese people. Our quarrel was with the leadership, because we wanted them to surrender and they didn't want to surrender. Now, they had agreed to surrender to us, the Japanese. The only contingency was that they wanted to keep their system of government, which at the time was they had an emperor. And so their condition for surrender was that we would allow them, we wouldn't interfere in their government, and we would allow them to basically restructure themselves. Okay? And we didn't like that. That wasn't that didn't fit our goals. as far as how the end of the war was going to play out. There was a certain amount of natural resources and a certain amount of money to be made in dealing with the Japanese later on, after the war was over. And so we told them to pound sand, and that those conditions for surrender were unacceptable. And at the time, we had an operating office of the U.S. government that was censoring news and really basically all publicly available information based on the fact that... Oh, gay. Am I not live on Facebook anymore? That's super not cool. Dang. So anyway, they basically said, like, I just got a notification that I'm not on Facebook anymore because HBO's mad that I'm showing their shit. Your video is blocked. Can't be viewed by others. How rude is that?